Hey, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here with Epan Thamby. I'll let him introduce himself here in a second, but before we get started, please like, subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you think about what we're doing. If you dislike, go ahead and subscribe, and you can hate watch me, and you can send the same comments you have been sending both through YouTube and in my DMs on social media. I like reading them. They're great. I'm not sure where I stand politically now based on your comments, but with that, Epan, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I'm a long-term, advocate, lobbyist, activist for drug policy and criminal justice reform. Uh, Over the last decade, I've worked extensively on civil asset forfeiture, marijuana legalization. Now I think society is ready for a larger conversation about drug decriminalization and legalization of other drugs after marijuana. So, certainly had a very interesting and very interesting career. And, I think we're beginning to see a lot of things kind of change, systemically in America's criminal justice system. So, I definitely appreciated you when you were in the lieutenant governor's office when we met several years ago, and we came
Yes.
to talk to you about medical marijuana policy. And I was always surprised by how receptive Jefferson City was to the idea. And I'm glad that we were able to create a greater degree of awareness in some of these issues.
Oh no, I agree. And like you said, I was working in the lieutenant governor's office when we met, when you were lobbying for the legalization of medical marijuana, and you had a great emphasis on the ability of veterans to access it. And I'm a veteran, and the one you're talking to, I mean, we can go through. I went through Prozac and Effexor and Klonopin, and I can keep going on a list of stuff they had me on at various times.
Yeah.
And well, now I'm on vitamins and some sinus medicine, but that's it. At the time, though, I think there would have been value in me had it been available and legal for me to partake in it. I think it would have helped.
Yeah, there's no question. I think one of the big issues that we've had, especially with medical marijuana, is that over 40 years, we have had very minimal clinical collection of data and clinical trials, right? I think there's only been one trial that the FDA has approved in over the last generation or so for medical marijuana, and or at least for the whole plant botanical marijuana, as opposed to any kind of processed or extracted product. And that was actually a clinical trial on whole plant smoked cannabis as a therapeutic for intractable PTSD in Air Force veterans. That was
Yes.
done by Dr. Sue Sisley out of the Scottsdale Research Institute in Arizona.
Yeah,
And
you actually got her to come down and talk to us about it.
yeah, it was crazy. We had absolutely no support from, there was 3 different ballot initiative campaigns that were raising and spending millions of dollars. And we had absolutely no support on bringing in America's leading clinical researcher on marijuana to Jefferson City, because they didn't want us to get anything out of the legislature. And we actually had a physician, Representative Dr. Jim Neely from Cameron, Missouri, who had created Missouri's right to try statute, which allows you to access through a regulated framework, unapproved FDA drugs.
Yes, I think there was a federal. I think Trump actually pushed through a federal law.
Yeah, so we had a proposal in 2017 and 18 sponsored by Dr. Neely, where we would have expanded Missouri's right to try law to include marijuana, to include Schedule I drugs. And then in 2018, Trump, signed off on the federal version of the first step.
Yes.
There's now a federal analog to Missouri state law that allows for a federally regulated process outside of FDA jurisdiction to access and use drugs that have passed the stage 1 of a clinical trial but have not been fully approved. And that's really been a tremendous step, because the criticism of the FDA is they're just really timid and don't. It takes forever, and it's extremely expensive. It costs like $1 billion to bring an investigational drug to market, right? And
Yeah.
and the process can be 5 years to a decade very easily, right? And especially with Schedule One drugs like marijuana, you've got plenty of good data, or at least you've got data, but it's not from clinical trial collection, at least not in this country. The Israelis have done a tremendous job of clinical trials and clinical data collection. But
yeah, and you actually turned me on to a lot of those studies. And I mean, the Israeli Defense Force actually allowed active duty soldiers to participate in trials for PTSD after the last war in Lebanon.
Oh yeah, yeah. The Israelis have they're one of her most important allies in the Middle East, and it was Israeli scientists who actually identified and extracted, I think, a lot of the cannabinoids that we now realize have a ton of medical value, right? And so they were definitely the pioneers. It was, I think, over $1 billion, maybe $2 billion worth of investment into, clinical trials and medical development in Tel Aviv this year. And we're hoping that some of those resources come to the United States. I've been kind of looking and working with a group called Neom Medic, which is this is an Israeli company out of Tel Aviv that has 12 years of data collection from the Israeli medical marijuana program. So they have an extraordinarily broad and deep data set that allows them to make dosing recommendations and product recommendations for numerous conditions, accounting for comorbidities and polypharmacy, which is that data is gold once you have a company that has is looking to put an investigational drug application in front of the FDA, because now there's data to substantiate a lot of clinical uses for this. And, companies like this Israeli company have it.
Yeah, and I like that you brought up the comorbidity, because I know going through VA is generally, if you're diagnosed with PTSD, you're also diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, generalized depression disorder, or they make it more specific, but generally you're diagnosed with 2 or 3 things along with the PTSD. And I know the meeting we had with Dr. Sisley, you were able to hand off a thumb drive to me it was over a gig of different research reports that other countries had already done research on the effects of marijuana when used in PTSD trials. And they all showed great success.
Yep. So, hopefully, we're not too far away from a federal policy change on this. Chuck Schumer, the majority leader of the U.S. Senate, has pledged to put a bill on the Senate floor soon. The House has passed in the last year has passed a comprehensive marijuana reform policy. And hopefully we'll see something negotiated between the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate this year. I think what's really interesting is that the Biden administration has done a lot. I think that's not really getting a lot of recognition right now. But from the Department of Justice and federal regulatory perspective, we now have an attorney general who is openly talking about why he doesn't think that going after marijuana use is a good use of federal resources. The new Associate Attorney General, Vanita Gupta, who was confirmed recently, is a big advocate for marijuana legalization and decriminalization. You have a Health and Human Services Secretary Becerra from California, who has been an advocate for marijuana, medical marijuana as well. And you have the new DEA nominee, Ann Milgram, who is the former attorney general from New Jersey. She was actually supportive of the implementation of the New Jersey medical marijuana program in 2009. Right. So what I think this kind of all adds up to is I think we're going to see one of two things, maybe both, who knows. But it looks like from the executive standpoint, the Biden administration is beginning to posture in terms of a rescheduling of marijuana from Schedule 1 maybe to Schedule 2 or 3. Who knows? Now, of course, I think the big debate in Congress is, should we move it down a schedule and do it that way, or should we deschedule it like we have done for tobacco and alcohol? So I think I think the window has shifted significantly. In other words, right? I think the most significant debate we're having on this again is, should we deschedule it or should we reschedule it, and how should that change happen? Should it happen through legislation or should it happen through executive action?
Well, I can give you the opinion I have, and that's based on other videos. People who watch my videos know I think it should happen through legislative action, because I think Congress needs to actually accomplish some things. Yeah. But let me go back to it, because I don't think I've ever actually expressed this opinion. I've been confronted about it, and I finally gave my opinion. I am a libertarian leaning independent, but I do support full legalization of recreational marijuana. And as somebody who's traveled to Colorado and in Denver, I actually talked to a few people that worked in a dispensary there. Their whole argument with legalization was not that it was legalized. It was done so rapidly. There really wasn't a lot of thought process for the taxes and everything else to go with it. So I would like to see it legalized, regulated, and have kids and adults educated on it, just like we do with alcohol now or tobacco now. Let's treat it the same way as we treat alcohol. Because I mean, that's, in all honesty, I would almost, okay, you want to ban something? We'll ban alcohol and legalize marijuana. It has far less, in my life experience in almost 49 years, marijuana has far less physical and emotional and evil ramifications. I've seen people do far worse things on alcohol than I have on marijuana in my life. I'll just leave it at that. I think it should be legalized and regulated.
Yeah, you ask any cop, would you rather deal with someone who's drunk or someone who's stoned? It's no contest.
Unless he gets between me and my Cheetos.
Yeah,
but I am for full legalization, because I think we're at a point now. We just need to accept, because if you want to go back and you watch all these specials, and there's quite a few of them, the History Channel did one. Basically, the first laws against marijuana came about and dealt with Mexican immigrants bringing it across.
Mm-hmm. And then you had in the 20s and 30s, there was, jazz musicians, mostly black and Mexican immigrants. And then in the 60s and 70s, under Nixon, there was, Nixon hated Jews and he hated hippies.
Yes.
Right? So he looked at drug prohibition as a way to deal with the hippie problem, right? And it was definitely an instrument of a culture war from an earlier generation.
Yes.
And, what's fascinating is the University of Missouri Historical Society, which is, I think, is it still on the Mizzou campus? I think they moved it to a new building or to a new facility in the last couple of years. But they have a collection from a San Franciscan folk ethno-linguist named Peter Tammany, right?
I did not know that. That's something I want to go check out now.
Yeah, so this guy he kind of collected media, newspaper clippings, posters, signs, magazines, all kinds of media, print media, over with covering a lot of vernacular, words and ideas that were kind of part of our American English history. Right. So so at the Historical Society, they have like probably a tractor trailer full of boxes of like media specific to specific words and phrases that were common in the last 100 or so years. And the collection, I think itself, is primarily composed of media between 1910 and 1984 or 85 when he died.
Yeah.
But if you pull the box on marijuana and hemp, right, there's like 3 boxes of like media, right? So like it's really extraordinary to see the rhetoric of 1910 and 1920 and 1930 and how it develops through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, right?
Yes.
And I documented a lot of these a lot of this media. It's a fascinating history. So like I'm here in Kansas City right now, and there's part of that collection. There's union cards from jazz musicians in the 20s and 30s where they're sanctioned for getting arrested for marijuana by the union. There's articles from local newspapers. There's a publication here in Kansas City called the Westport Trucker, right? Kind of a countercultural,
I'm actually familiar with it.
Right. And I found this op-ed in the Westport Trucker in like 1972, right? So in 72 or so, there was a big crackdown on marijuana in Kansas City, and police came in and arrested all the pot dealers and growers in Westport, which was kind of a historic center of drug culture. And there's this op-ed in this newspaper, the Westport Trucker, talking about how after they removed all the potheads in Westport, the heroin dealers came in, right? And talked about this shift from marijuana usage to opiate usage. And it was like you could take the dates and place names and names of certain people out, from the 1970s and replace them with current day names and dates, and it would be very relevant today, right?
Yeah.
When you think about it, you have opiate epidemic kind of on a generational track. You had opiate epidemic in the 30s, you had it in the late 60s, early 70s. You had it, in the last decade, right? And especially in terms of pain management and medication, for that has wide applicability to a number of conditions that involve chronic or acute pain, right? The use of marijuana as an analgesic is typically considered very safe, right? But
yes.
You take these options away from people, and they go to much more dangerous drugs, which, I think I think the opiate epidemic of the last decade has had a lot to do with how we think about drug policy, right? Because number one, it has really given us America a perspective on what dangerous drugs are, right? Marijuana maybe you don't like the smell, maybe you don't like the effect, but you can't argue that it's non-toxic and it has pretty minimal side effects, with some minor exceptions in some, specific individuals. So it's a relatively very safe drug, No,
I would agree with that 100% based on what a friend told me.
Right.
No, you know where I'm going with this. It's like I said, I would rather deal with, and you brought it up with police. Based on my experience, and I'll own my experience, you said police said, I will say based on experience, and this is as somebody who still actually imbibes occasionally, but the difference that I've seen, especially from the standpoint of 17, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old alpha males in the military, I've seen far worse repercussions from alcohol than I ever have from marijuana.
Yep. And to kind of go back to that point, I think law enforcement, after 20 years has realized, you can't arrest your way out of opiates. You can't arrest your way out of methamphetamine, right?
Oh, you're talking about part 2 with criminal justice reform, because we're definitely going to get into that one.
Yeah. And so, I think so. Like these kind of underlying trends, I think, have had a lot to do with how marijuana has gotten so widely accepted. There's a poll that came out, I think, a month ago from Pew Research that shows between medical and recreational marijuana support, 91% of Americans support some kind of legalization. I mean,
Yeah, that was about a month ago. I know exactly what report you're talking about.
can you think of any other issue in American society that has 91% agreement?
Kittens and puppies are cute. That's about it.
Yeah.
And I think we'd be lucky to break 90% on that one. Now, we talked about marijuana. We're going to change gears a little bit because I want to bring up something that I have read some research on this, and I've listened to a couple of interviews with people, but it's the use of psychedelics and psychotherapy. And all the reports I read had to do with PTSD. But what surprised me was the fact that every single report I read had over a 90% success rate.
Yeah, so psychedelics, we're talking about psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, MDMA.
Yes.
There's the African root iboga, which is a very powerful psychedelic, ayahuasca, which is kind of coming into vogue. And
ayahuasca is the one I've actually researched the most out of all of them.
That's 5-MeO DMT primary psychedelic there, right? So I'll highlight one thing about psychedelic use in psychotherapy is that, number one, you don't really get necessarily the benefits that we're talking about without a therapeutic regimen, right? So
yes,
right. So you can take a psychedelic, but you have to do what's called integration therapy, right? You have to, and I work with a couple psychedelic psychotherapists here in Kansas City who are beginning to look into this field, right? So, for instance, a couple of years ago, I think the FDA approved ketamine, which is a psychedelic. It's a dissociative, right?
Yes.
So FDA has now approved ketamine for I think PTSD or trauma therapy or no, refractory depression is what the approval is for.
Can we pause for 1 second?
Sure.
Okay, so ketamine, for anybody that's out there listening and my subscribers that don't know, is on one hand is considered a tranquilizer used by veterinarians, but it is also used by special operations medics in the military. So ketamine is in general use in various places. This is just an additional use that they're coming up with for it.
Yeah.
I just wanted to explain that real quick.
Yeah. So the FDA now has approved ketamine for refractory depression, right? So you can go to a physician, you can get a ketamine prescription. I've heard of injection-based therapies. I've heard of oral therapies, so like a pill or a tablet.
Yes.
Right. And then you go to a psychotherapist and you consume the ketamine, or you get the IV or whatever, right? And after you come out of the dissociative state, you do kind of a integration talk therapy, right? Because you've had an experience where you're, the word psychedelic itself, I think, is really interesting, right? Psyche in Greek is.
Go ahead.
Yeah, psyche in Greek means mind, and delos, which is the other half of the root, is to reveal. So, psychedelic literally means mind revealing, right? So, I'm the science of psychedelics is, I'm not a scientist, but these drugs have, I think, profound capacity to, to give your brain new pathways of growth and healing, especially in trauma therapy, right? But I want to point out, another study that came out a couple of months ago. So MDMA, commonly known as ecstasy, right? It was used by psychotherapists in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, I think. And then in the 80s,
actually, it was up until the 80s. And I remember when MDMA was still available in liquid form in nightclubs in the late 80s.
Yeah.
I'm actually old enough to remember that part.
So yeah, became known as a party drug in the 80s, and that's why they banned it. But
yes,
FDA recently has indicated has given it breakthrough drug status as well in the last year, and so I think it's just a matter of time before they reschedule it and make it legally available. But I think 2 months ago, a British researcher from London published a study indicating that MDMA is a breakthrough drug for alcohol use disorder, right? And so you got to think about this. In modern medicine, we still do not have a viable therapeutic regimen for alcoholism. We don't.
Well, and I will say this, because this is kind of weird, because you can withdraw from cocaine or heroin or methamphetamines, but withdrawing from alcohol in the end is physically more dangerous from the standpoint of convulsions and everything else than those other narcotics combined.
Right.
There's more people that die withdrawing from alcohol than you do withdrawing from heroin.
Oh, yeah.
So MDMA being used for that was great. And one of the studies I read was actually for PTSD, and it was a very limited study. I think it was only 6 or 8 individuals. And they did, I think it was 4 to 6 doses, depending on the individual. And they would take their dose, they would go through, they would do their talk therapy, but the success rate with it is phenomenal. It really shocked me how successful it was using that.
Yep. So, what was I saying here? So, MDMA in this British study, is now believed to be a breakthrough therapy for alcohol use disorder, and this is extraordinary, right?
It is.
But I think the underlying logic that the study is kind of elaborating is that a lot of alcoholism is fundamentally related to trauma, right? And so, which is probably one of the reasons why we don't have an effective therapy for alcoholism yet, right? Because 12-step is nice, but really all it is putting you in a community of people who are trying to do the same thing, and that's good. It's effective for some people, but it's not very effective generally, right? But if you can treat the underlying trauma issues, then people don't feel the need to self-medicate with alcohol, right? And so I think that's the underlying logic of why MDMA and other psychedelics, psilocybin or LSD, have such great potential for reducing severe alcoholism.
Well, no, I mean, I think you're right. I think if we don't address the baseline issue that led to, and it's not just alcohol, but it's any narcotics use, generally there's a baseline issue that led to people self-medicating. And if that does, and we don't do a good job of addressing that. And as men, it's not accepted sometimes that they actually attempt to address that baseline issue.
Yep. So, and then you have, there's a lot of, Oregon last year legalized psilocybin for therapeutic uses, right? So now they're implementing this law that will allow people to grow and access legal psilocybin mushrooms, which are also recognized. Psilocybin is now recognized also by the FDA as a breakthrough PTSD therapy. So I'm pretty hopeful for rescheduling, and I'm pretty hopeful for further action at the state level. So in Washington State, there is a lawsuit actually against the DEA, because the federal right to try statute, which Trump signed, actually does not have an exclusion for Schedule I drugs. So the way the statute reads is that you should be able to use a Schedule I unapproved drug, which the definition of Schedule I is has no accepted medical use or utility and high potential for abuse, right? Which, first off, I think we're now in a point in society where we realize that many of the drugs that we've put in Schedule I are miscategorized. Like marijuana is the obvious example.
No, that's the example I was going to use. That marijuana is on the scam schedule as heroin or methamphetamines.
Right. And think about cocaine. Cocaine is actually Schedule II, right? Yeah. It's approved as a topical anesthetic, especially in eye surgeries, right? But to think that marijuana federally right now has a status of, is not approved for anything is unbelievable, right? But to go back to my point, all these Schedule 1 psychedelic medications, I think we're at a point where, the conversation has opened up significantly at the FDA level in terms of rescheduling. So I'm very hopeful to see that happen.
Well, I would agree with you on that because all the studies I've read, I mean, about 3/4 of them are what you gave me when I was still at the Lieutenant Governor's office, but other ones I've looked up since then, like the MDMA study with veterans dealing with PTSD. I do think that's the future, but let's do this. Let's go ahead and cut this off here. And ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned for part 2 because we're going to talk about criminal justice reform, which is where we'll get more into we'll actually address some of the issues that lead people to prison. But subscribe, let me know in the comments what you think. If you dislike, go ahead and hit dislike, subscribe. You can hate watch and tell me in the comments or in my DMs what you think. But on the other hand, if you're going to talk about my guest, Epan, be nice, be civil. And with that, Epan, hopefully you'll stick around and we'll do the criminal justice reform video.
Sounds good. Thank you, Bill.
All right, everybody have a good evening.